We've all heard the phrase, "hell hath no fury like a woman scorned." But what happens when the scorned woman doesn't scream, doesn't cry, and doesn't throw a drink? What happens when she simply smiles, picks up her phone, and systematically dismantles her husband's entire empire in under 60 seconds? Picture a crowded, opulent ballroom in Manhattan. A bold, overly confident mistress decides it's her moment to humiliate the quiet, unassuming wife in front of New York's elite. She thought she was establishing dominance and claiming her prize. She had no idea she had just triggered the absolute financial execution of the man she was sleeping with. Stick around, because the revenge in this story is served ice cold. Claire Montgomery was not a woman who needed to scream to be heard. At 34, she possessed the kind of quiet, understated elegance that came from old money specifically, the kind of generational wealth that didn't need to brandish designer logos to prove it existed. She was an art restorer by trade, spending her days breathing life back into forgotten Renaissance canvases in a dust-moated studio in Brooklyn. To the outside world, and more importantly, to her husband's flashy circle of tech entrepreneurs, she was just Richard's lovely wife. Richard Sterling was the CEO of Sterling Innovations, a mid-sized tech firm that had recently hit a valuation of $200 million. Richard loved the spotlight. He loved bespoke Italian suits, leased sports cars, and giving interviews to business magazines where he touted his self-made journey. He frequently spoke about his grueling climb from a middle-class upbringing in Ohio to the penthouse suites of Manhattan. What Richard conveniently left out of every interview, every keynote speech, and every boastful dinner party conversation was that Sterling Innovations would have gone bankrupt 3 times in its first 5 years if not for the silent, untraceable injections of capital from Claire's private trust fund. Claire didn't mind the omission. She loved Richard, or at least the man he used to be, and she wanted him to feel proud. She was happy playing the supportive wife in the background while he soaked up the applause. But success has a funny way of rotting a fragile ego. As Richard's bank account swelled, so did his arrogance. He began working later. Business trips to Silicon Valley extended through the weekends. His phone, once casually tossed on the kitchen island, was now glued to his hand, locked behind a new passcode. Claire wasn't stupid. She noticed the subtle shifts. The faint smell of a cloying, aggressively sweet vanilla perfume on his coats. The way he jumped when she entered the room unexpectedly. But the definitive proof came on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. Richard had asked Claire to log into his iPad to email a PDF to his accountant. When the device unlocked, it didn't open to his email. It opened to his iMessage app, which was syncing in real time. There were dozens of messages from a contact saved simply as CD. Marketing. Can't stop thinking about last night at the Cent. Rageous. You're too good to me, Richie. See you at the gala. I bought the red dress. Claire stared at the screen. Her heart didn't chatter. It simply turned to stone. CD was Chloe Davenport. Chloe was Richard's newly appointed director of marketing. She was 25, fiercely ambitious, and notorious around the office for treating the company like her personal runway. She had thousands of Instagram followers, a penchant for dramatic networking, and apparently a taste for her married boss. Most wives would have confronted their husbands right then and there. They would have thrown the iPad, packed a bag, and called a divorce lawyer. But Claire was raised by a grandfather who had built a ruthless shipping empire. She had been taught that emotion is the enemy of strategy. Confronting Richard now would only give him time to hide assets, spin a narrative, and play the victim. Instead, Claire closed the iPad. She made herself a cup of chamomile tea, sat by the window overlooking Central Park, and began to formulate a plan. The annual Sterling Innovations Winter Gala was exactly 2 weeks away. It was the most important night of Richard's year, a massive networking event meant to secure a Series C funding round that would push his company to $1 billion valuation. Claire decided she wouldn't just leave Richard. She was going to let him dig his own grave, and she was going to let Chloe Davenport hand him the shovel. The night of the gala arrived, cloaked in a bitter December chill. The event was held at the Plaza Hotel, a venue Richard had insisted upon to project an aura of untouchable success. The grand ballroom was a sea of crystal chandeliers, towering arrangements of white orchids, and the most influential venture capitalists on the East Coast. Claire arrived on Richard's arm, wearing a vintage floor-length black velvet gown. She wore no jewelry except for her wedding band and a pair of flawless diamond studs. She looked regal, composed, and entirely out of place among the flashy tech wives draped in sequins. Richard, on the other hand, was sweating through his custom tuxedo. He was hyper-aware of the guest list, his eyes darting around the room, making sure the right investors were being catered to. But Claire knew he was looking for someone else. "I need to go shake hands with the board," Richard said, his voice tight, pulling at his collar. "Be a dear and entertain the wives at table 1, will you? Keep it light." "Of course, darling," Claire said smoothly, taking a sip of sparkling water. "I'll be right here." 10 minutes later, the double doors of the ballroom swung open, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop. Chloe Davenport had arrived. She wasn't just wearing a red dress, she was wearing a declaration of war. The gown was a scarlet, backless silk slip that clung to her like a second skin, with a slit that traveled dangerously high up her thigh. She walked with the exaggerated confidence of someone who believed she owned the room, pausing to air-kiss executives and laugh a little too loudly at jokes she hadn't quite heard. Claire watched from the edge of the dance floor as Chloe's eyes scanned the room, bypassing the junior staff and locking directly onto Richard. Richard stiffened visibly, his face flushing beneath his carefully applied bronzer. He quickly excused himself from a conversation with an older investor and intercepted Chloe before she could reach the center of the room. From a distance, Claire could read their body language perfectly. Richard was whispering frantically, likely telling her to tone it down. Chloe was pouting, tracing a finger playfully over Richard's lapel. It was an intimate, possessive gesture that sent ripples of whispers through the nearby guests. Claire's best friend, Samantha, a sharp-tongued corporate lawyer who knew everything about the affair, materialized at Claire's side, handing her a flute of champagne. "Please tell me I have permission to accidentally spill this entire glass of Veuve Clock on that cheap silk," Samantha murmured, glaring daggers at Chloe. "Patience, Sam," Claire replied, her voice eerily calm. "Let her have her moment. She's about to give a masterclass in self-destruction." Eventually, dinner was announced. The seating chart, which Richard had insisted on finalizing himself, placed Claire at the head table alongside Richard, the key investors, and the senior executive team. Unsurprisingly, Chloe Davenport was also seated at the table, placed just 2 seats away from Richard. As the first course of delicate lobster biscuit served, the tension at table 1 became palpable. Chloe was holding court, dominating the conversation with buzzwords and exaggerated stories of her marketing triumphs. She was aggressively charismatic, but it was a brittle, desperate kind of energy. "And then I told the development team," Chloe was saying, leaning across the table so that her cleavage was prominently displayed toward the male investors, "if you want the millennials to bite, you have to sell the lifestyle, not just the software." Richard totally agreed with me. "Didn't you, Richard?" She used his first name with a familiarity that breached professional boundaries. Richard cleared his throat, looking everywhere but at his wife. "Yes, well, Chloe's department has been instrumental in our recent rebranding." Chloe beamed, taking a large sip of red wine. Then her eyes shifted, landing squarely on Claire. The predator had finally noticed her prey. "It's just so exhausting, though," Chloe sighed theatrically, resting her chin on her hand. "The long hours, the late-night strategy sessions at the office. But I suppose you wouldn't know much about that, Claire. Richard tells me you work with old paintings?" The table went dead silent. The clinking of silverware stopped. Even the oblivious venture capitalists sensed the sudden sharp shift in the atmosphere. "I'm an art restorer, yes," Claire said, her voice even and pleasant. "Fascinating," Chloe drawled, a condescending smirk playing on her lips. "It must be so nice, so relaxing, just staying home, playing with paint all day, while the real world is out here hustling and building empires. I always tell Richard he needs a woman who can keep up with his drive. Someone who understands the grind." Samantha, sitting to Claire's left, gripped her butter knife so hard her knuckles turned white. Richard looked as though he was going to vomit. "Chloe, that's enough," Richard hissed, his voice a panicked whisper. But Chloe, emboldened by the wine and her own inflated sense of security, ignored him. She looked at Claire with undisguised pity. She was ready for the kill. "Oh, don't scold me, Richard," Chloe laughed, a high, ringing sound that grated against the jazz music playing in the background. "I'm just making conversation. It's important for the wives to understand what we do, the stress we carry. I mean, behind every great man is a woman, right? But these days, it's usually the woman working alongside him in the trenches, not the one picking out the curtains." She took another sip of wine, her eyes locking onto Claire's. "No offense, Claire. I'm sure your little hobby keeps you very busy while Richard is out here changing the world." The audacity was breathtaking. Several executives at the table suddenly found their napkins incredibly interesting, staring down at their laps. The primary investor they were trying to court, a grizzled old billionaire named Harrison Cole, raised a bushy eyebrow, looking between the three of them with predatory amusement. Claire did not blink. She did not flush. She gently placed her spoon down on the saucer, the clink ringing out sharply in the quiet tension of the table. "None taken, Chloe," Claire said, her voice projecting effortlessly. "Art restoration does require a tremendous amount of patience. You spend months carefully removing layers of cheap, gaudy overpaint that someone carelessly slapped on, just to reveal the true value underneath. It teaches you how to spot a fake from a mile away." Chloe's smirk faltered slightly, her eyes narrowing. She wasn't used to a target fighting back with elegance. She was used to catfights. "Well," Chloe snapped back, her tone losing its faux sweetness, "some of us prefer the future to the past. Sterling Innovations is moving into a new era. We're securing Series C funding. We're going global. Richard and I have big plans for the company's direction." Richard and I. The pronoun shift was not accidental. It was a flag planted firmly in Claire's territory. "Is that so?" Claire asked, turning her gaze slowly to her husband. "Richard, are you and your marketing director planning the financial future of the company together now?" "I wasn't aware." Richard looked like a man standing on the trapdoor of a gallows. "Claire, please. Chloe is just passionate about her job. Let's not discuss business tonight. Tonight is a celebration." "But I love discussing business." Claire smiled, a cold, terrifying smile that did not reach her eyes. She turned back to the mistress. "Tell me, Chloe, since you are so intimately involved in the grind and the strategic direction of Sterling Innovations, what is your contingency plan if the bridging loan from Apex Capital falls through next week?" Chloe blinked, taken aback. She opened her mouth, closed it, and looked at Richard for help. That's not marketing's department. That's finance." "Oh, but I thought you were in the trenches together." Claire pressed, her tone light, almost musical. Surely you know that the company's debt-to-equity ratio is currently teetering at a dangerous 3-1, and that without a silent guarantor backing the Series C round, the valuation you keep bragging about is effectively monopoly money. The table was completely paralyzed. Harrison Cole, the billionaire investor, let out a low, appreciative chuckle, taking a sip of his scotch. Chloe's face flushed a blotchy, uneven red. The mask was slipping. She leaned forward, slamming her hands on the table. Look, I don't know what kind of financial jargon you memorized to sound smart tonight, but you don't know anything about this company. You don't know anything about Richard. I know what he needs. I know who he is. You're just the dead weight he's too polite to drop. Chloe! Richard shouted, half standing up from his chair. Get out. Now. Aye! Chloe shrieked, the wine fueling her rage. She pointed a manicured finger at Claire. Are you going to let this housewife talk down to me? Tell her, Richard. Tell her we're in love. Tell her you're filing the papers on Monday. A collective gasp echoed from the surrounding tables. The music seemed to stop. The entire grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel went dead silent, hundreds of eyes turning toward Table 1. Richard stood frozen, his mouth opening and closing like a landed fish. He looked at Chloe, then at the investors, and finally at Claire. His silence was the loudest confession in the room. Chloe stood tall, chest heaving, a triumphant sneer plastered across her face. She had done it. She had forced his hand. She had blown up the marriage and claimed her territory in front of New York society. She looked at Claire, waiting for the tears, the screaming, the pathetic retreat of a broken woman. Claire picked up her linen napkin, elegantly dabbed the corners of her mouth, and placed it on the table. She reached into her clutch and pulled out her phone. Filing papers on Monday, Claire murmured, unlocking her screen. How incredibly proactive of you, Richard. I suppose that saves me the trouble of serving you. She dialed a single number. The room was so quiet that everyone could hear the faint rhythmic ringing from the earpiece before the call connected. Yes, Claire, my dear. A deep, gravelly voice answered through the phone. Claire held the phone up slightly. Hello, Uncle Harrison. I'm sorry to interrupt your evening, but I have an instruction regarding the Sterling Innovation accounts. At the opposite end of the table, Harrison Cole, the billionaire investor, the man Richard had spent the last 6 months begging for funding, the man who was supposed to save the company, pulled a ringing cell phone away from his ear and smiled directly at Claire. I'm right here, sweetheart, Harrison said, his booming voice carrying across the silent ballroom. What do you need? Chloe's triumphant sneer vanished, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated confusion. Richard fell back into his chair, as if he had been shot. All the blood drained from his face, leaving him a ghastly, translucent white. Uncle Harrison, he whispered, his voice cracking. Yes, Richard, Harrison Cole said coldly, dropping the jovial investor facade entirely. Claire is my goddaughter, and the sole beneficiary of the Cole-Montgomery Blind Trust. You know, the trust that holds 74% of your company's voting shares. Claire stood up. She smoothed the velvet of her dress, her posture perfectly straight, looking down at the trembling figures of her husband and his mistress. Uncle Harrison, Claire said, her voice ringing out clear and steady like a bell. I'd like to initiate an immediate vote of no confidence to remove Richard Sterling as CEO. Furthermore, please pull the guarantor backing for the Series C funding. Let's see how well they do in the trenches without my money. The silence in the grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel was no longer just palpable. It was suffocating. It was the heavy, atmospheric pressure that precedes a devastating hurricane. Hundreds of New York's elite tech innovators, venture capitalists, and socialites stood entirely motionless, their expensive champagne warming in their hands, their eyes locked on the catastrophe unfolding at Table 1. Richard Sterling, the self-proclaimed visionary of Sterling Innovations, looked as though he were physically shrinking inside his custom Tom Ford tuxedo. The swagger, the arrogance, the polished veneer of the self-made man, it all evaporated in the span of 60 seconds. He looked from Claire, who stood with the serene composure of a marble statue, to Harrison Cole, whose face was set in a mask of absolute, unforgiving granite. "Harrison," Richard choked out, his voice a pathetic, reedy wheeze that cracked over the jazz music that had cautiously started playing again. "Harrison, wait. Let's not be hasty. This is a personal matter. It has nothing to do with the company's valuation or the Series C round." Harrison Cole laughed. It was not a pleasant sound. It was the dry, abrasive bark of a predator who had just cornered its prey. He slowly lowered his cell phone, placing it deliberately on the white linen tablecloth. "A personal matter," Harrison echoed, his voice booming with the authority of a man who had destroyed stronger men before breakfast. "You arrogant, foolish boy. You think this is about you sleeping with your marketing director. Men ruin their marriages every day in this city. It's a cliché. I don't care who you take to the saint." Richard. Harrison leaned forward, bracing his heavy hands on the table. "I care that you lied to me. I care that you sat in my boardroom, drank my scotch, and presented yourself as the sole architect of this company, all while leveraging my goddaughter's trust fund to cover your abysmal operational deficits. You aren't a CEO, Richard. You're a very expensive liability operating on Claire's charity. And as of 30 seconds ago, that charity has run dry." Chloe Davenport, who had been standing with her chest puffed out in defiant victory moments prior, was now trembling. The alcohol in her bloodstream seemed to curdle. Her gaze darted frantically around the table, taking in the disgusted expressions of the senior executive team. Nathaniel Reed, the chief financial officer who had always been skeptical of Chloe's massive marketing budget, was looking at her with an expression of pure, unadulterated venom. "Richard," Chloe whispered, reaching out to grab his sleeve. "Richard, what is he talking about? You said you owned 51%. You said you were untouchable." Richard violently yanked his arm away from her, his face contorting with panic and fury. "Shut up, Chloe. Just shut up." The illusion was shattered. Chloe suddenly realized the catastrophic error she had made. She hadn't just humiliated the wife of her wealthy lover, she had publicly insulted the secret owner of the entire empire. She had essentially walked into the throne room, mocked the queen, and demanded the crown, completely unaware that the queen owned the castle, the guards, and the executioner. "I believe we are finished here," Claire said smoothly. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Every year at the table was straining to catch her every word. She picked up her vintage beaded clutch from the table. Samantha, her best friend and legal counsel, stood up beside her, offering a brilliant, terrifying smile to the shell-shocked table. "It's been a lovely evening, gentlemen. I suggest you all check your portfolios on Monday. It's going to be a bumpy ride." As Claire turned to walk away, Richard lunged forward, scrambling out of his chair so fast he knocked over a crystal water goblet. It shattered against the hardwood floor, a sharp, violent sound that made several guests jump. "Claire, wait, please," Richard begged, abandoning any shred of dignity he had left. He grabbed her wrist, his palms sweaty. "Claire, we can fix this. I'm sorry. She means nothing. It was a mistake, a stupid mistake. You can't just pull the plug on everything we've built." Claire stopped. She looked down at Richard's hand gripping her wrist, then slowly raised her eyes to meet his. The sheer temperature of her gaze made him immediately release his grip, stepping back as if he had been burned. "We haven't built anything, Richard," Claire said, her voice dropping to a low, icy register meant only for him. I built the foundation. I provided the safety net. You just built a very flashy, very fragile ego on top of it. And you chose to wreck it for a cheap thrill in a red dress. She glanced over his shoulder at Chloe, who was now clutching her arms around herself, realizing she was entirely isolated. The other wives at the adjacent tables were staring at her with open, mocking disdain. "Enjoy the trenches, you two," Claire said softly. With that, Claire Montgomery turned on her heel and walked out of the grand ballroom. The crowd physically parted for her, stepping aside to let her pass. There were no whispers as she walked by, only a stunned, reverent silence. She exited the Plaza Hotel into the freezing Manhattan night, stepped into the waiting town car Samantha had preemptively ordered, and finally took a deep, steadying breath. The first stalk was done. Now it was time for the slaughter. Back in the ballroom, chaos erupted the second the doors closed behind Claire. Harrison Cole stood up, buttoned his suit jacket, and looked down at Richard, who was hyperventilating near the shattered glass. "My legal team will be in touch on Monday morning, Richard. Do not attempt to access the corporate accounts. Do not attempt to contact Claire. If you so much as breathe in her direction, I will personally see to it that you are litigated into the Stone Age." Harrison walked out, taking his millions in backing with him. The other venture capitalists at the table, sensing the sinking ship, quickly muttered their excuses and scattered. Within 10 minutes, the table was empty, save for a sobbing Chloe Davenport and a hyperventilating Richard Sterling, surrounded by the ruins of their own hubris. The weekend was a masterclass in psychological warfare, orchestrated entirely by silence. Richard called Claire's cell phone 84 times. He left voicemails ranging from tearful apologies to furious defensive rants, back to pathetic begging. He showed up at their Brooklyn brownstone, only to find the locks changed and a pair of burly private security guards stationed at the wrought iron gate, politely informing him that he was trespassing. By Monday morning, Richard was a wreck. He hadn't slept. He was wearing the same shirt from Sunday, and his eyes were bloodshot and frantic. He arrived at the Glass and Steel headquarters of Sterling Innovations at 7:30 a.m., desperate to access his office, shred some questionable expense reports, and somehow spin this disaster to the board of directors. He swiped his keycard of the private executive elevator. Beep. Red light. He frowned, swiping it again. Beep! Red light. "Having trouble, Mr. Sterling." Richard spun around to see Sarah Jenkins, the no-nonsense director of human resources, standing in the lobby, flanked by 2 corporate security officers. Sarah had never particularly liked Richard, finding his leadership style abrasive and his constant favoritism toward the marketing department highly unprofessional. Today, she looked entirely unbothered by his panic. "Sarah, my card is malfunctioning," Richard snapped, trying to project his usual authority. "Get security to bypass the system. I have a crisis management meeting to prep for. I'm afraid your access has been temporarily suspended, Richard," Sarah said calmly, handing him a sealed manila envelope. "Pending the results of the emergency board meeting currently taking place on the 40th floor." Richard's stomach plummeted to his shoes. "Emergency board meeting? Without the CEO? They can't do that. I own the company." "Actually," a sharp aristocratic voice echoed across the marble lobby, "you owned precisely 12% of the company's non-voting shares, which, given the events of Friday night, are currently plummeting in value." Walking toward him was Theodore Blackwood, a senior partner at Blackwood, Vance and Sterling, ironically, no relation to Richard, but arguably the most terrifying corporate litigation firm in New York City. Theodore was a tall, silver-haired shark in a bespoke pinstripe suit, representing the Cole Montgomery Trust. Mr. Blackwood Richard stammered, backing up slightly. You can't lock me out of my own building. We already have, Theodore smiled, a cold, thin expression. The board convened at 6 a.m. Harrison Cole activated the morality and gross mismanagement clauses hidden deep within the Series A and B funding contracts he signed without fully reading, I presume. You have been officially stripped of your title as CEO, effective immediately, pending a full forensic audit of the company's finances. Richard felt the lobby spinning. Forensic audit? Why? The company is profitable. Is it? Theodore raised an eyebrow, opening a slim leather folder he carried. Because our preliminary glance at the books this weekend revealed some highly irregular expenditures, it seems the marketing budget has been heavily inflated over the past 8 months. Specifically, a corporate account was used to sign a lease on a luxury penthouse in Tribeca, a penthouse currently occupied by a Miss Chloe Davenport. Richard stopped breathing. The blood roared in his ears. He had thought he was so clever, hiding the apartment lease under experiential marketing venues in the budget. He hadn't realized that when you are playing with old money, they track every single red cent. That was for corporate retreats, Richard lied, his voice trembling. Save it for the federal investigators, Richard, Theodore said, snapping the folder shut. Using investor capital to fund a clandestine affair crosses the line from marital infidelity into corporate embezzlement. It's no longer a divorce proceeding. It's a criminal investigation. At that exact moment, the elevator doors pinged open and Chloe Davenport stumbled out. She looked entirely different from the predatory siren in the red dress on Friday night. She was wearing sweatpants, her hair was a mess, and she was carrying a cardboard box filled with her desk items. She was sobbing hysterically. "Richard!" Chloe screamed, dropping the box. Office supplies clattered across the immaculate marble floor. She ran toward him, but the security guard stepped in front of her, blocking her path. "They fired me!" Chloe shrieked, pointing an accusing finger at Sarah Jenkins. "They fired me, and they said I have to vacate the Tribeca apartment by noon. You told me that apartment was mine, Richard. You said it was a bonus." Richard stared at her, horrified, realizing that the woman he had risked everything for was now just another nail in his coffin. "Chloe, stop talking. You're making it worse." "Making it worse?" she shrieked, her voice echoing off the high ceilings as junior employees began gathering near the turnstiles, watching the spectacle with wide eyes. "You ruined my life. I'm blacklisted. Nobody in tech will hire me after Harrison Cole called his contacts. You promised me a ring. You promised me we'd run this company." Chloe lunged past the guard, grabbing Richard by his collar. "You're a fraud. You don't have anything. Your wife owned you. Security, please escort Miss Davenport off the premises," Sarah Jenkins instructed calmly. The 2 guards grabbed Chloe by the arms, dragging her toward the revolving glass doors. She kicked and screamed, hurling obscenities at Richard, cursing him for being broke, cursing Claire, and screaming about her ruined reputation until the heavy glass doors finally muffled her voice. Richard stood alone in the lobby of the building that used to bear his name, surrounded by employees who were now openly whispering and pointing. He looked at Theodore Blackwood, his eyes wide with a desperate, pleading terror. What happens now?" Richard whispered. Now Theodore adjusted his cufflinks, entirely unfazed by the drama. "Now you are going to take the settlement we offer you. You will surrender your remaining 12% of the shares to the Montgomery Trust at a severely depreciated rate to cover the funds you embezzled for your mistress. You will sign a non-disclosure agreement regarding Claire's involvement in this company. And then you will walk out those doors and never return." Richard swallowed hard, tears finally spilling over his eyelashes. "And if I fight it? If I take this to court?" Theodore stepped closer, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "If you fight it, Richard, we will release the audit to the SEC. We will let them tear through your life. You won't just lose the company. You will go to federal prison. Claire is offering you the mercy of walking away with nothing but your freedom. I strongly suggest you take it." Richard looked around the grand lobby. He saw the company logo on the wall, a company built on his wife's secret generosity, destroyed by his own staggering arrogance. He had traded a loyal, wealthy, powerful partner for a fleeting ego boost, and it had cost him his entire universe. Defeated, broken, and utterly humiliated, Richard Sterling nodded slowly. He turned around and walked out the glass doors into the cold reality of Monday morning, a self-made man who had just unmade himself completely. For Chloe Davenport, the descent from Manhattan's untouchable elite to a radioactive social pariah happened with a terrifying, neck-snapping velocity. New York City, for all its millions of inhabitants and sprawling boroughs, operates like a small, claustrophobic, and highly vindictive village when it comes to the upper echelons of wealth, tech, and power. Word of the Plaza Hotel catastrophe had ignited through the venture capital networks before the sun even rose on Saturday morning. By the time the corporate security guards physically escorted her out of the Sterling Innovations lobby on Monday, her name was already blacklisted across every major firm on the eastern seaboard. Her first instinct, naturally, was profound denial. Chloe had spent the last 2 years inhaling her own manufactured hype. She genuinely believed her 15,000 Instagram followers, a carefully curated LinkedIn presence, and her invaluable networking contacts would serve as an impenetrable safety net. Standing on the freezing pavement of 6th Avenue with a cardboard box of office supplies, she pulled out her phone and began dialing. She called Susan Miller, a heavyweight public relations executive at Edelman, who had happily drank Chloe's expensed champagne just a week prior. The call went straight to voicemail. She dialed a recruiter at Sequoia Capital who had been trying to poach her for months. Also voicemail. Finally, in an act of sheer desperation, she called an old college mentor, a senior marketing director named David Kensington. David answered on the 4th ring. "Chloe," he sighed, his voice tight and completely devoid of its usual warmth. "I only picked up to tell you to lose my number. I don't know what on earth possessed you to publicly humiliate Harrison Cole's goddaughter, but you are toxic waste right now. Nobody in the city is going to touch you. You're done." The line went dead before she could even formulate a response. The corporate rejection was swift, but the personal eviction was humiliating. When Chloe arrived back at the spectacular Place-Wall Tribeca penthouse that afternoon, her keycard flashed a violent red. Standing in the hallway was Mr. Peterson, the building's fiercely unsmiling property manager, flanked by 2 maintenance workers holding large black industrial trash bags. The corporate lease was terminated this morning by the firm's legal counsel, Mr. Poner. Peterson stated flatly, handing her a clipboard with a notice to vacate. "You have exactly 1 hour to gather your personal effects before the locks are permanently changed." Chloe was forced to frantically stuff thousands of dollars worth of designer clothing, shoes, and cosmetics into literal garbage bags while the maintenance crew watched in stony silence. When she dragged the bags down to the lobby and attempted to book a room at the Bowery Hotel, her Chase Sapphire Reserve card was instantly declined. The company had already frozen the accounts. With only $400 of actual liquid cash to her name, the former director of marketing was forced to hire an UberX and haul her trash bags to a dingy, basement-level short-term rental in deep Astoria, Queens. Sitting on a lumpy mattress that smelled faintly of mildew, the reality of her situation finally breached her arrogance. The corporate world was entirely dead to her. She had no job, no apartment, and no wealthy lover to bail her out. Her desperation breeds reckless, vindictive behavior. If she couldn't win in the boardroom, Chloe decided she was going to win in the court of public opinion. She pivoted to the only currency she believed she had left: scandal. She opened her laptop and drafted an email to Bradley Harrington. Bradley was a notorious, sharp-elbowed senior editor for the Manhattan Sentinel, a high-traffic, incredibly ruthless digital publication famous for tearing down tech unicorns and exposing high society gossip. He lived for corporate bloodbaths. Chloe offered him the exclusive tell-all interview of the year. Her angle was a meticulously fabricated masterpiece of victimhood. She planned to sell the tragic story of a young, brilliant female executive manipulated by an abusive, predatory CEO, only to be ultimately crushed by his jealous, vindictive billionaire wife who pulled the puppet strings from the shadows. Bradley, smelling a viral sensation, agreed to meet her late Thursday evening at a discreet dim-lit speakeasy in the West Village. Chloe arrived dressed down in an oversized trench coat, playing the part of the hunted, traumatized survivor to absolute perfection. For 2 straight hours, over 3 glasses of Pinot Noir, she spun her web of lies into Bradley's voice recorder. She cried on cue. She claimed Richard had threatened to fire her if she didn't sleep with him. She invented horrific stories about Claire Montgomery visiting the office to psychologically torment the female junior staff. "This is front-page gold, Chloe," Bradley assured her, his eyes gleaming with predatory excitement as he tapped his recorder. "It has everything: number Me Too dynamics, billionaire overreach, corporate corruption. We're publishing this on Sunday morning. It's going to absolutely blow the lid off the Montgomery Trust." Chloe returned to her grim Queen's basement, feeling a twisted, euphoric sense of victory. If she was going down, she was going to drag Claire Montgomery's pristine old money reputation through the mud with her. Sunday morning arrived with an overcast gray sky. Chloe sat on the edge of the lumpy bed, a cup of cheap instant coffee in her hand, aggressively refreshing the Manhattan Sentinel homepage on her cracked iPhone. At exactly 9 a.m., the site updated. The banner headline dropped. Chloe's stomach violently plummeted into her shoes. The coffee mug slipped from her fingers, shattering against the cheap linoleum floor. The headline was not her tragic survivor story. It read in bold, unforgiving letters, "The Red Dress Frayed, How a Marketing Prodigy Embezzled Millions to Fund a Manhattan Fantasy." Her hands shook so violently she could barely scroll down the screen. There were no quotes from her tear-stained interview in the West Village. Instead, the article was a brutal, meticulously detailed, and legally bulletproof breakdown of her financial crimes. The Sentinel had published high-resolution, unredacted images of the forged lease agreements for the Tribeca apartment. There were detailed spreadsheets showing how Chloe had set up a fraudulent shell company, Davenport Creative Solutions, billing Sterling Innovations hundreds of thousands of dollars for non-existent market research. There were itemized receipts of corporate funds illegally wired directly to luxury boutiques in Paris and Milan. It even included devastating internal email transcripts, proving she had actively threatened the junior accountants to bury the paper trail. At the very bottom of the expansive, career-ending article was a small, lethal editorial note from Bradley Harrington himself. When approached by Miss Davenport with scandalous accusations regarding the Montgomery family, the Sentinel's legal team reached out for comment. "We were immediately provided with comprehensive forensic audit records by Samantha Hayes, lead counsel for the Montgomery Coal Trust. These records not only thoroughly disproved Miss Davenport's fabricated claims, but revealed a startling, prolonged pattern of corporate theft and wire fraud. The Sentinel has declined to publish Miss Davenport's false statements and has turned all interview recordings and financial documents over to the New York District Attorney's office." Claire hadn't just anticipated Chloe's desperate move to the media. She had laid a flawless trap and let the mistress walk right into the jaws of it. What Chloe didn't know was that Claire's best friend and attorney, Samantha, had gone to Columbia Law School with Bradley Harrington. They had been close friends for over a decade. The very second Chloe had emailed the tabloid, Bradley had forwarded the pitch directly to Samantha. They smoothly traded the fake, legally risky victim story for the real, documented financial crime story, a much safer, undeniable piece of journalism that protected the publication from libel while simultaneously executing Chloe. Chloe's phone began to vibrate violently on the mattress. It wasn't recruiters, it was her mother, calling from New Jersey, hysterically screaming about a local news van parking on her front lawn. A second later, an automated email chimed in from the New York State Department of Labor, notifying her that her application for unemployment benefits was permanently frozen pending a criminal fraud investigation. She had tried to play chess with a woman who literally owned the board. Panic, absolute and blinding, took over. Chloe knew that once the district attorney got involved, an indictment was days away. That afternoon, the once arrogant marketing director abandoned her garbage bags of designer clothes, packed a single duffel bag with her remaining essentials, and boarded a Greyhound bus at the Port Authority heading west toward the Midwest. She deleted her Instagram, permanently deactivated her LinkedIn, and vanished from the city that was supposed to make her a legend, leaving behind nothing but a cautionary tale of what happens when you mistake a lion's silence for weakness. 6 months later, the golden spring sunlight filtered through the massive skylights of Claire Montgomery's Brooklyn studio. The space smelled of turpentine, aged canvas, and quiet victory. Claire, dressed in faded denim overalls, leaned close to a 17th-century Dutch master's landscape. With the surgical precision of a trained restorer, she dipped a cotton swab into a mild solvent, gently rolling it across a darkened patch of the painting. Years of grime and yellowed varnish melted away, revealing the vibrant cerulean blue beneath. Stripping away the ugly superficial layers to uncover the authentic value underneath was what she did best. The irony was not lost on her. Her life had never been quieter, yet it had never felt more resonant. She didn't need to attend flashy galas anymore, or pretend to laugh at the tasteless jokes of venture capitalists. The cancer had been excised from her life. Downtown, the atmosphere at the newly rebranded Montgomery Coal Innovations hummed with a different energy. The toxic culture Richard had carefully cultivated was systematically dismantled. Sarah Jenkins stepping up as permanent CEO, a cleaned house. The bloated marketing department was restructured, wasteful spending was cut, and the Series C funding had closed at a valuation 20% higher than Richard ever projected. But the true masterpiece wasn't the financial turnaround, it was the legal butchering of Richard Sterling, orchestrated by Claire's attorney, Samantha. Samantha turned the divorce proceedings into a scorched earth campaign. Because Richard utilized company funds to lease the Tribeca penthouse for his mistress, he violated the infidelity clause buried deep within his ironclad prenuptial agreement. He was entitled to nothing. To avoid federal prosecution, Richard was forced to liquidate his remaining personal assets, watches, leased cars, his Hamptons timeshare, just to repay the stolen funds and cover his exorbitant legal fees. He walked away with a crater where his future used to be. For Richard, the fall from grace was a slow, agonizing crawl through the mud. Stripped of his wealth and reputation, the city rapidly spat him out. With no savings and the scandal silently following him across background checks, he retreated to the only place that would take him, his hometown in Ohio. It was a dreary, rain-soaked Tuesday afternoon in Cleveland. Richard sat slumped in a gray cubicle on the third floor of a mid-level logistics company. He was 38, working as a regional sales coordinator, cold-calling trucking dispatches all day. He wore a cheap suit bought off the rack. The collar chafed his neck. The sleeves were too short. His new reality was a constant torment: the smell of burnt drip coffee, the incessant clicking of keyboards, and the agonizing commute in a dented Honda Civic smelling of old fast food. He had moved into a cramped apartment near the highway, where passing semi-trucks kept him awake. In the dark, he would stare at the ceiling, his mind replaying the night at the Plaza Hotel on a continuous loop. He was entirely alone. Chloe had blocked his number, and his former friends treated him like a leper. He had traded a kingdom for a fleeting thrill, and the realization was eating him alive. At 12:15 p.m., Richard dragged himself into the fluorescent-lit break room to microwave a frozen lasagna. As the timer hummed, his eyes drifted to a discarded copy of the Wall Street Journal. The breath was instantly knocked out of his lungs. Dominating the front page of the business and tech section was a full-color photograph of a sleek boardroom. Sitting at the head of the mahogany table, radiating an aura of untouchable power, was Claire. She wore a tailored navy blazer, a knowing smile playing on her lips. Standing behind her was Harrison Coe. The bold headline screamed, "The Quiet Takeover: How Art Restorer Claire Montgomery Saved a Tech Empire." Richard's hands began to shake uncontrollably. He picked up the paper, his eyes scanning the subtext. The article detailed the incredible pivot the company had made, praising Claire's decisive action to remove toxic leadership. There was no mention of the affair, no mention of Chloe. The narrative focused entirely on Claire's brilliance and Richard's complete incompetence. He was a footnote in his own legacy. The microwave beeped loudly, but Richard didn't hear it. The sharp agony in his chest was so intense, he thought he might have a heart attack. He stumbled backward, dropping the newspaper. Pushing through the office's glass doors, he ran out into the pouring rain. He collapsed into the driver's seat of the Honda Civic, slamming the door against the storm. The windows began to fog up as he hyperventilated. The isolation, the poverty, the overwhelming regret. It was too much. He reached into the glove compartment, his fingers trembling as he pulled out a prepaid cell phone. He had memorized her number weeks ago, but had always been too much of a coward to press call. Today, desperation won. He dialed. It rang 3 times. The sound echoed in the damp car like a death knell. "Hello?" The single word was a physical blow. Her voice was exactly the same, calm, melodic, completely unbothered. Richard's throat closed up. Hot tears spilled over his eyelashes, mixing with the rain dripping from his hair. "Claire?" he whispered, his voice cracking. "It's Richard." There was a pause on the line. No gasp of surprise, just a profound, heavy silence that stretched for agonizing seconds. "I saw the article," Richard choked out, sobbing into the receiver. "You're beautiful, Claire. So beautiful. I just needed to hear your voice. I wanted to say I'm sorry. I know it means nothing to you now, but I am so sorry. I lost everything. I lost my company. I lost my dignity. But most of all, I lost you. I was an arrogant fool. Every single day I wake up in this hell and I realize what I threw away. Please, Claire, just talk to me. Give me 5 minutes. Please." He waited, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tight his knuckles turned white, praying for a shred of the empathy she once gave freely. He waited for anger, for screaming, for anything proving she still cared enough to hate him. Instead, through the crackling speaker, Claire let out a soft, imperceptible sigh. It wasn't sadness or lingering affection. It was the distinct, irritated sigh of a woman interrupted by a telemarketer she had already asked to stop calling. "Richard," Claire said softly, her tone laced with absolute chilling indifference. "I'm in the middle of restoring a priceless painting, and as I recall telling your little friend that night at the plaza, I really have no patience for dealing with cheap fakes." The line went dead. Richard pulled the phone away from his ear, staring blankly at the dark screen. He dropped the phone onto the passenger seat, leaned his head against the cold window, and let the reality of his existence wash over him. Alone in a rainy parking lot in Ohio, working a dead-end job, living a dead-end life. Richard Sterling wept. He wept for the empire he never truly built, the wealth he never truly earned, and the queen he had so foolishly forced to become his executioner. Back in Brooklyn, Claire Montgomery placed her phone face down on the wooden work table. She didn't look out the window. She didn't shed a tear. She simply picked up her cotton swab, dipped it back into the solvent, and continued clearing away the dirt, bringing a masterpiece back to life. And that is how you execute a flawless emotional and financial checkmate. Claire didn't just walk away, she took the entire board with her, leaving Richard and his overly confident mistress sitting in the ashes of an empire they falsely claimed as their own. It's a stark reminder. Never underestimate the quiet ones, and definitely never insult the woman who is secretly funding your lifestyle. What did you think of Claire's ice-cold revenge? Would you have handled it differently, or was this the ultimate mic drop? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. If you love this story and want more juicy, dramatic, real-life tales of revenge and karma, make sure to hit that like button. Share this with a friend who loves the drama, and subscribe to the channel for more crazy stories every single week. Catch you in the next one.